Last Tuesday, as is my usual practice, I went up to the Town and Country Diner in Bordentown to attend my regular clergy breakfast with the ministerium up there. It was a difficult morning because Michael from the Dorothy Dix community, Unitarian Universalist Church, he was already seated. He was the first one there, and I came in right after him. He was sitting alone until I joined him. Michael had just lost his wife of over 30 years the Thursday before. He was grieving. I sat down and greeted Michael with a, "I'm so sorry for your loss." And he nodded. And we sat there without very many words. A few moments, Pastor Elizabeth arrived, and without any words, just went to Michael, put her arm around him and hugged him, and tears welled up. And we sat in silence. It was a time to grieve, and so we just sat and grieved. The late priest and Harvard University professor Henry Nouwen wrote, "When we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand." Sometimes there just aren't any words and no formulas to get over it. It's just time to grieve. When I pastored up in the Groveville United Methodist Church, a First Methodist church that I was a senior pastor, Verna Longmire was a widow there. She had grieved the loss of her husband for many years, and she said to me, "Pastor Kim, you never get over it. You just get used to it." You know, God wired us for grief. And if you have an ounce of humanity in you, if you love anyone, and if you love anything, you will experience the pain of grief. Your heart will be broken. To love is to make yourself vulnerable, open to hurt, amenable to sorrow. We resist that, but it's true. C.S. Lewis, the Welsh writer, wrote these words: "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable." To love is to make ourselves vulnerable to sorrow, to grief, and to pain. Brene Brown, you can get her online if you look up TED Talks and or search for YouTube. She's done a whole study of vulnerability, and she wrote this: "I think our capacity for wholeheartedness can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted. It means engaging with the world from a place of vulnerability and worthiness." People who love can experience the most exquisite pain, and it will happen to all of us if we have an ounce of humanity, whether it is our parents, a child, a spouse, a friend, or even a beloved pet. Now, our Bible today, our text that Peggy read, projects us like a time machine back in time 950 years before Christ into a period of deep grief. In fact, the text invites us to a funeral. It is a national period of mourning because Israel suffered a crushing military defeat by their perennial enemies, the Philistines. And not only was the army defeated, it was nearly annihilated like Custer's regiment in Little Bighorn, his last stand. But Israel's king was also killed in that battle. In fact, not only was Saul the king killed as a casualty of war, but also his 3 oldest sons, fighting side by side, lost their lives in the battle. And to rub salt into the injury, the enemy beheaded the royal family members and desecrated their bodies by hanging them up on a wall and had a day of celebration. But for Israel, it was a day of national humiliation and mourning. The people felt helpless, impotent to do anything. They went numb with shock, outrage, pain. They felt paralyzed, and the Philistines just marched into towns and villages to take whatever they wanted, and the people couldn't do a thing. David grieved too. He was fighting on a different battlefront when he heard the news and came. Saul was not only his king, but was his father-in-law as well. And the oldest son, Jonathan, was David's best friend and most devoted supporter. And so David's pain was exquisite. How could this happen? God wired us to experience grief. We resist it. We resist it in the way we use language. Think of how we use language to describe grief. Well, Shirley was doing so well, and then she broke down. Broke down? Really? Because she finally wept? Yeah, Jason was holding up, and then suddenly he just fell apart. Broke down, fell apart, went to pieces. We use this kind of language because it seems like something went wrong when we do those kind of things. But it's the most natural thing in the world. Weeping is the most natural response to grief and loss. Having no words, not knowing what to do with the pain, it happens. Weeping is a part of mourning. Weeping is to bring pain to public expression. And we do so by mourning, by weeping. Jesus attended a funeral. It was almost over. He was 4 days late. Lazarus had died. He was already in the tomb. And when Jesus arrived, and he saw the mourners playing their sad songs, and the wails and the moans, and he looked at the pain etched on his friends Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters. Puffy eyes, puffy face, eyes lined in red. It said, the shortest verse in the whole Bible, Jesus wept. He cried at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. But in this funeral where David was, all eyes were on David because people knew that Saul the king, David's father-in-law, hated David. There was an obvious rift in the family between the father-in-law and son-in-law. Because for years, Saul had felt jealous of David, thought David was a big threat. And this placed his friend Jonathan in a difficult position of being David's best friend and brother-in-law, but at the same time the son of Saul, and Saul hated David and wanted David dead and tried to kill him. Saul forced Jonathan to choose between him and David, and he chose David, much to his father's chagrin. And that caused a deep abrasion in Saul's own immediate family. I've been in ministry, full-time Christian ministry, for 43 years now. And I've witnessed a lot of pain and a lot of heartbreak. And I've been with many families in their moments of mourning. I've been at bedside when a loved one passed into the next life. I've seen families, though, torn apart, their dysfunctions come on full display, their rifts exposed, especially in death, because grief can often bring out our most ugly side. I visited a woman in the hospital when I was a pastor at Groveville. Somebody had said, would you visit this distant relative of mine? I had no knowledge of who she was. I only knew this man in our church. So I went down to the Helene Fold Hospital at that time. I went in and I found a lady there. I can't remember what her name was, but I didn't know whether she wanted to visit or not. I went in to visit with her, and she was almost catatonic. I do not know if she was refusing to acknowledge that I was even there. She stared forward. I don't know if he was just in a state of mind that she could not come out of it, but when I went in, I said a few words. I introduced who I was. She was not speaking to me or even looking at me, so I sat down. I said a brief prayer for her well-being, and I put my card down. Back in those days, I actually had one. And I left. It was weeks later. I never gave it much thought, but I get a call from a funeral director. He said, you're Pastor Kim Crutchfield, right? I said, yeah. I said, can you do the funeral for so-and-so? And I said, I don't think I know that person. Are they connected with the church in any way? And he said, well, they must be, because you were the only one that visited. You left a card. And the family want you to do it. I said, is there anyone that I can contact and talk about the funeral coming up in the next day or so? He said, well, there's brothers. One is very sick, said is in Trenton. The other one lives in Morristown, and one is coming up from Tennessee. They've already left to get up here for the funeral. I said, well, can I have the number of the one in Morristown? He said, sure. So I called the guy. I said, I'm the pastor that you have asked for. I said, thank you. I said, I'd like to maybe get together with you about your mother's funeral. He said, well, I really don't have time for that. Okay. I said, maybe we can do it over the phone. He said, yeah, that's better. So I said, well, I usually start out this way because people want to talk and want to grieve or something. And I said, funeral is kind of a thanksgiving for the life of your mother. And I wonder what you would be thankful for, that I could weave into my prayers, into my little homily. And the phone was silent for a moment. Then he said, you know, you've asked something hard, because I can't think of a single thing I'm thankful for my mother. She was a mean woman. She didn't have any use for us, never wanted to see the grandkids, and I haven't seen her since 1953. So this is going to be a love of God sermon. The amazing thing is the next day at the funeral, the brother had arrived from Tennessee. That brother that I talked to from Morristown, they were there. And I preached a sermon about God's love extending beyond the boundaries of the church, and that we make footprints in whatever we leave, and that's the way it is. It was made personal because one of the guy coming from Tennessee, his wife was a Lutheran deaconess, and she had written something very wonderful for the mother that said, Mom, we really did love you, but we felt like Jesus reaching out. How often we would reach out, but you would not, but we did love you. It was a sad day. And then I heard the news that the other brother that was in Trenton, when he heard that his mother had died, went into an asthmatic attack, and his funeral was the next day.
Holy Toledo.
So I've seen some things about grief and family disorganization, dysfunction. David did what he could. You see, this David at this funeral had a shepherd's heart. And the truth is, every real pastor is a shepherd. To come to grips with the national tragedy and his personal loss, David called upon his talents to process the pain. He wrote a song. He entitled the song, The Bow. And he wanted that sung at Saul and Jonathan's funeral. In the song, he did not mention all the harm that Saul had done to him, the way Saul had hounded him and generally made his life miserable and kept him on the run. Instead, he extolled the virtues and bravery of King Saul. And he wrote a song that is a lament that Peggy read this morning. It's a complaint. David was known as the sweet singer of Israel, a warrior. He was a military commander. He was a shepherd. He was a rock star musician. And David wrote a song and had it taught so that everyone could sing it together and do honor to their dead king and his family. The book of Psalms is a book that serves as the hymn book of Israel, much like we have our United Methodist hymnal that has the hymns we sing, and also the faith we sing is a supplement. But in the book of Psalms, it's in the middle of our Bibles, we find 150 distinct psalms. Did you know 1/3 of those songs are laments. Laments are complaints, bringing pain to public expression. And we need those laments. The Psalms, and especially the laments, helps us get in touch with pain. The amazing thing about Israel in their worship is they did not cover up their disappointments. They did not cover up their distress. They did not cover up their loss. It's kind of like singing the blues. They took it with them to worship and they prayed it out loud to God. They brought their pain to public expression. And that's part of what a minister is supposed to be doing. A minister is to help us bring what's really going on into the public expression, because the church is not a happiness cult where everybody's happy. We will find disappointment. We will be offended. We will have relationship trouble. We will have problems at home. And if we just come and put the mask on and put the face on, does it really help us that much? You see, a minister's job, I learned a long time ago, is to do something that God is doing. Bring form to formlessness. Because we're in grief, everything is shattered. We are sort of falling apart. But how do we begin to reconnect and put the pieces together? It's a minister's job to help them own the grief. Not cover it over with 10 easy steps on how to get over your spouse's death or 7 steps to deal with your cancer diagnosis. Life is lived in cycles of orientation and disorientation and new orientation. Jesus' ministry, Jesus' death, Jesus' resurrection. It's a pattern. Orientation is when everything goes well. Maybe that's where you are today. Right now, things are going pretty well for me, honestly. Job secure, bills are paid, children are happy, everyone's happy. The Eagles have both Carson Wentz and Nick Foles ready at the quarterback position. So things are going okay. But the company downsizes and suddenly your job at 22 years is gone. Or you get a call that grandmother just had a stroke, she's not going to make it. Can you come down to North Carolina? Or you experience a ripping divorce that you never wanted to happen. Well, the telephone comes with a diagnosis. Did you know it's cancer? We need to start treatment right away. Or a couple that were so eager to have a child instead have a miscarriage or a stillborn. Or a deep depression has set in and you just can't shake it. Or you have a child that's suffering from an addiction, doing everything that they can to get over it, but not being successful. Or a child comes out and expresses that he or she is a lesbian or gay, and you know that church folk just don't love them the way you do and don't understand them the way you do and haven't been through the lives that you have been through. Or a church gets downgraded and is forced to close down or combine with another congregation in the next town, and it's a period of grief. And I know people who have left the church that have given their time and talent and energy and money and everything else to, and something happened and they're discouraged and disillusioned, and they go through a deep grief process. And we look to God, because only God can take the broken shards of our shattered dreams and form them into a beautiful stained glass window through which God's light streams with all of its glory and color. Tragedy strikes and we move from an ordered reality of orientation and suddenly are thrust into disorientation and everything's out of whack and life gets thrown out of kilter and we face something threatening and new and different. And our first impulse is, no, this cannot be happening. Don't tell me that. I was at a church in Atlanta and we were having a day that was on both sides. We had ball fields and places to play, and we're having a picnic on the grounds, and people were playing, and kids were kicking soccer balls and throwing baseballs, and it was so much fun. We had food to eat, but then somebody kicked a ball, and it went rolling into the road. And little Keith Brown went running there. He was about 9 years old. Didn't take a moment to look, just went to get the ball when a car came flying down the street. I saw it when he was hit. His body flew up in the air and came down on the top of the car. And his dad was running. And he said, no, no. ran and took his child in the arms in the ambulance, and it took a long time to get over that. The child lived, but it wasn't the end of their tragedy. As a young person, he got involved in drugs and ended up being murdered, shot right in a bed. Grief. Of course we resisted. Our lives are suddenly thrown into chaos. Our lives are marked and changed, and we don't like change. It's like when people come to church and somebody's sitting in your favorite seat. That's just a little bit of thing. But God helps bring chaos into cosmos. Chaos is when everything's crazy. Cosmos is when we have an ordered reality. You know the scripture, the Bible begins with these verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. That's the creation story that tells how God brought cosmos and ordered reality out of chaos. And God does that over and over again as our lives plunge into darkness and chaos, but God hovers over us, broods over us, same word in the Hebrew, to form us and to bring new order and new orientation. But it takes time in owning the darkness. The Hebrew word hovering or brooding is used in Isaiah 31:5. Like birds hovering overhead, the Lord Almighty will shield Jerusalem. He will shield it and deliver it. He will pass over it and rescue it. Or again in Deuteronomy 32:11, like an eagle protecting his nest, hovering over its young, God spread out his wings and took hold of Israel and carried him on his back. God hovers over us. God broods over us. God will bring order back. God will bring form to formlessness, but not always when we want it and the way we want it, and not ever without going through the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. Jesus marked that way for us. And he said, if you want to be my disciple, take up that cross and follow me. God is the one who brings life out of death and resurrection out of the tomb, and joy after mourning. Psalm 35 puts it this way, weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. We need handles to hang on our grief, and that's where the church comes in. That's where liturgy comes in. That's where the psalms of lament come in. Because we need some kind of fabric board to begin reweaving the frayed warp and woof of our lives when we become unraveled. A way to process the pain, to make sense of it, and to make sense of us. When my older brother was dying of leukemia when I was 18 years old, I had left the hospital. My brother was suffering terribly. It was December 31st. I went out to get something to eat, and when I came back, my brother had died. I wasn't there at the moment. But I remember what my dad said in fatherly grief, a son, 33, 34 years old at the time. He just said, I feel like Job. I feel like Job, and I just want to say, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And he found that story that is full of lamentations, a handle in which helped him to make sense of what had happened. And what I think people really want is a community of authenticity, of compassion, a real community where we're authentic and real with each other. And Paul put it this way. The one who said, rejoice with those who rejoice, also said, weep with those who weep. No more covering up. Let's be real. We're going to be burying some people really soon around here. There's going to be some people that need comfort. Not somebody to give advice or pour out a solution, but just simply to be that person that touches the wound with a loving hand. Let us pray.